The following video gives an example of a Year 7 Historical Inquiry task presentation. Hi, I'm going to be doing my historical inquiry today on Aboriginal Australia, which is something my class has been looking at for the last couple of weeks. My guiding question is, how long have the Aboriginal people been in Australia? And I came up with this question because I thought about all of the things that I already knew about Indigenous Australia, and I came up with some areas of things that I didn't know about. And I realised that I'd overheard someone talking about the idea that maybe the Indigenous Australians hadn't always been here and maybe they had migrated as well, but I didn't know anything about it, but I was really interested in it, so that's why I picked this question. For my research, I want to look at some information that was written by people about it, but I also want to find one artifact which still exists today, and I also want to see if there was any writing or any evidence of people sharing their perspectives back during that time as well. So the first thing I had to do to answer my question was I went to this website, or I did a Google search, and I found this website for the Australian Museum, and this was really helpful because it showed me some of the ideas that people have had about the movement of Indigenous Australians, and it told me all about the movement across the world and across the map. So one idea is that the Aboriginal people moved from Africa, and they essentially migrated through Africa and then down through Indonesia into Australia. And the other idea was that perhaps people might have come from Asia, so moved more through Asia and from China and actually moved down through that way. So I thought that was really interesting, and I read a lot about some of the artifacts that have been found. Like there was a number of different things that have been found consequently in Indonesia that show both African and kind of Chinese culture, which suggests that there was some migration there, but I didn't look into those too deeply because they weren't really directed to my question. When I did look at my question a bit more, I realised I had to find some evidence that people might have moved to Australia. And the website gave me a great idea to look for things like evidence of human remains here in Australia, or evidence of tools and rock art and shell middens, because if there was evidence of those, the oldest human remains or the oldest tools or the oldest types of art might work really well as artifacts that could show how long people might have been in Australia. I also got the name of a couple of locations in Australia where I could research to find some of these early remains. So one of those places was Lake Mungo, and I did a bit of researching around a couple of places, but this was definitely the best website I found, and it's for the Mungo National Park. And this gave heaps of explanation as to why stone artifacts and bones and shells are so important in finding out about the past. And there were some really great examples of things in here, which was really cool. This was an example of one of the tools, or this is what's called a grindstone, and I read all about this, and this kind of showed that the Indigenous people would have used this not only to kind of crush things like leaves or herbs, but they also used it to rub up against other stones to create sharp points that they might have used for tools or for hunting. So I thought that was really cool, but there wasn't any timing associated with this. It didn't tell me how old it was, so I had to be a little bit more directed to find an artifact that might tell me how long the Aboriginal Australians have been in Australia. And that's when I came across this idea of the Mungo man and the Mungo lady, who are the oldest human remains found on the Australian continent. So I thought that was really interesting, and it made mention of them, but it didn't really tell me how old they were, and it didn't show me any photos of them. So then my next goal was to start searching for that. So I did some searching, and this was an article that I found that was really helpful, and it was from The Guardian, and it was talking about how they were moving the artifacts, or moving the fossil of the Mungo man and the Mungo lady. And you can see just down the bottom here, the Mungo man was found in 1974, and the Mungo lady was found in 1969, so she was just before that. But when they dated them, they found out that they were over 42,000 years old, And if these were some of the original Aboriginal people, this might suggest that the Aboriginals might have migrated across from Africa or Asia maybe 42,000 years ago. So that really started to answer my question. So I chose to use, and this is actually the Mungo Lady, but I chose to use the Mungo Lady as my artifact because I just think that's really good evidence to support the idea that maybe people haven't always been in Australia. I also then had to look for some of the writing, and I found that really tricky because it turns out that Aboriginal people didn't really write, or they didn't have a written language, so there weren't any books or scrolls or letterings around the place, but what there were, and what I decided to count as my perspectives part of the task, was the cave drawings, because that's how they communicated and that's how they told their story, and a lot of their artwork tells the story of their background. So then I asked myself the question, well, what's the oldest recorded cave drawing? And I did some research and I found this really great article by ABC, and it talked about cave drawings in general, but it also made mention of the oldest cave drawings, which were dated 28,000 years ago in Arnhem Land. So I thought that was really interesting, but I couldn't find any information on any of the sites I looked at that showed a piece of artwork that was dated longer than 28,000 years ago. So in answering my question, the evidence and the research I've found has given me these things. So firstly, it told me that if the Aboriginal people weren't always in Australia, that they probably came from either Africa or from Asia around the China region, and they migrated through Indonesia. The oldest dated human remains in Australia are 42,000 years old. So, that tells us that it could have been 42,000 years ago that the Aboriginal people migrated to Australia. The oldest dated form of writing or communication I used was the cave drawings, and that was 28,000 years ago. So the answer is we're not actually sure exactly how long the Aboriginal people have been in Australia, but my evidence would suggest that it's between 42,000 and 28,000 years approximately, according to the most up-to-date research. And just lastly, I looked at lots of different websites in part of my research, but these are the 4 main ones that I took information from that helped me answer my question. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I hope that you've learned something.